Good morning, everyone. Bienvenue. We're going to get started. So my name is Michelle Hurtubise, and I'm the Executive Director of Centretown Community Health Centre. And on behalf of Centretown CHC, I'm pleased to welcome you to the release of the Ottawa People's Commission second part of its report, After the Occupation, Change. Before we begin today, I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. We would like to honor and acknowledge that we hold this land on the unceded and never surrender territories of the Algonquin Onoshawpic people. To be present on this land is a privilege, and we thank the Algonquin Onoshawpic people for providing us the space to work here, live here, learn here, to be here. And it is part of our ongoing responsibilities and accountabilities that we work towards reconciliation and reconciliation ourselves. Part of the context of this report is that our commissioners have spoken about this and have named this and agreed with sort of the colloquial expression of this being an occupation. But it is really critical that we situate this work with the acknowledgement that as Canadians, we are also occupying the lands of many, many Indigenous people across this country, and this report begins with this reality. So Centretown was one of many organizations, businesses, and residents who were located within the infamous red zone during the Convoy Occupation, but we were not the only parts of the city that was occupied or impacted by this. But within a few days of this unprecedented event, questions were being asked as to what could be done in the moment and what could be done differently to prevent an event like this from happening again. When we were approached to support an Ottawa People's Commission, we stepped up to take on this work because as a community-driven initiative of Centretown Community Health Centre, we believe that this was part of our role as a community health centre to support and foster safe spaces for civic discourse. S'engager en faveur de la santé et du bien-être signifie s'assurer que nos rues et nos espaces communautaires sont des espaces sûrs pour tous. Il ne fait aucun doute que l'occupation du convoi a eu un impact négatif important sur la santé physique, émotionnelle et mentale de nombreuses personnes qui vivent et travaillent dans les quartiers de la ville. Pas seulement le centre-ville, on a été touché par les événements de l'année dernière. A commitment to health and well-being means ensuring that our streets and our community spaces are safe spaces for everyone. There is no doubt that the impact of the Convoy Occupation had a significant negative impact on the physical, emotional, and mental health of many of the people who lived and worked in the areas of the city, not just Centretown, that were impacted by the events of last year. So before I turn this over to our MC today of our press release, our project coordinator, Gaëlle Muderi, I want to thank our staff, Rachel, Stacy, Scott, and Gaëlle, all of the volunteers, our co-chairs of our steering committee, Robert Fox and Brenda Knight, who worked so hard on this initiative, and most importantly, the leadership and stewardship of our incredible commissioners, Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, Leilani Farha, Monia Mazigh, and Neve, who took on more than we ever imagined when we first asked them. And we are pleased to see this report come forward and are honored to be a part of supporting this incredible testimony. Thank you for joining us here today. Gaëlle.
Thank you for indulging me. Good morning, everyone. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Merci de vous joindre à nous ce matin. Je m'appelle Gaëlle Muderi. Je suis la coordinatrice de projet pour la Commission populaire d'Ottawa. My name is Gaëlle Muderi. I'm the project coordinator for the People's Commission. And just for those who are following us online, this event is being live streamed. There is a short delay, just so you are aware, so you may be a minute behind. Today marks the release of part 2 of our final report, After the Occupation, Change. It follows part 1, which was released in January, which chronicled the community impact of the Convoy Occupation from the perspective of over 200 residents and organizations, including members of the community who were in support of the convoy. Through various consultations with the community, there was a clear sentiment that authorities had not recognized the far-reaching impact of the occupation and their failure to protect human rights in this city. As such, we offer 25 recommendations grouped under 8 calls to action to rebuild the community's trust and build transformative change in the city. I will pass it over to our commissioners who will speak further to those recommendations, and we'll open it up to questions afterwards. Merci.
Thank you, Gaëlle, and good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Neve, one of the 4 commissioners, and we will be speaking in turn this morning. Trust, leadership, human rights, accountability, community, responsiveness, communication, inclusion, hate. We learned so much from the residents of Ottawa about what they endured during last year's convoy occupation and what needs to change now. Jusqu'à présent, les examens officiels du convoi ont accordé peu d'espace pour entendre le point de vue de la communauté. C'est pourquoi il était si important de convoquer la Commission populaire d'Ottawa sur l'occupation du convoi. Et c'est pourquoi le rapport que nous présentons aujourd'hui, fondé sur les témoignages que nous avons reçus de plus de 200 résidents, travailleurs et entreprises locales du centre d'Ottawa, doivent être pris au sérieux par les 3 ordres de gouvernement. In the report we are releasing today, after the occupation, change, we expand on the analysis of our Part 1 report, What We Heard, which was released on January 30th. We make it clear that this was far more than provocative protest. It was an orchestrated occupation, a word we use deliberately, of central Ottawa that brought life in those neighborhoods to a standstill and left thousands of people isolated and traumatized. An occupation that would not have been tolerated in other parts of the city, but was allowed to take hold in lower-income neighborhoods home to vulnerable communities. An occupation that became entrenched in the unceded lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people with no respect for their leadership and traditions. We explain why we reject out of hand that the convoy experience was mainly peaceful. It was violent, both physically and psychologically. It was replete with violent human rights abuses. People were violently assaulted and accosted. They were tormented by sound torture and by the violence of racism and hate. For many residents of Ottawa, the legacy of that violence remains 14 months later, easily triggered by a loud horn or a Canadian flag on a passing truck. We look closely at the troubling extent to which people were utterly abandoned. At a time when the obligation of governments and police to act decisively to protect people from unrelenting human rights abuses was crucial, they were instead left to cope on their own. That stunning level of abandonment has shattered people's trust in officials. Nous examinons également la remarquable mobilisation communautaire qui a eu lieu. A eu lieu parce que les gens sont résilients en temps de crise, oui, mais a eu lieu principalement parce qu'il n'y avait nulle part ailleurs où chercher protection et soutien que les unes envers les autres. La mobilisation elle-même a rarement été soutenue et encouragée et en fait a parfois été minée et découragée par les responsables, ajoutant au sentiment d'abandon. We also consider what we heard from a minority of Central Ottawa residents who were convoy supporters. They did not see the convoy's harms and violence. After 2 years of feeling misunderstood and shunned because they had made their own choice not to follow COVID-19 protocols, they felt understood and validated. From that analysis, we draw 4 overarching conclusions, which are the basis for our recommendations. These conclusions go far beyond mishaps that are perhaps inevitable during an unprecedented crisis. Instead, they lay bare deeper deficiencies, far deeper deficiencies, that have long needed attention in this city, which were spotlighted and exacerbated by this exceptional situation. They touch on human rights, leadership and civic engagement, responsiveness, and dialogue and community building. First, everything about the convoy occupation points to an absence of human rights. The right to protest was upheld. Of that, there is no doubt. But all three orders of government and police wholly disregarded their obligation to protect community members from the human rights abuses they were experiencing and to fulfill such essential human rights as freedom of movement, health, access to health care, adequate housing, food, security of the person, and equality and non-discrimination, particularly for vulnerable community members. Deuxièmement, il y a un besoin évident de nouvelles approches en matière de leadership et d'engagement civique. Un leadership représentatif et inclusif en termes de genre, de race et de toutes les autres diversités. Un leadership responsable et ouvert, et un leadership qui encourage et soutient l'engagement civique, ne le traite pas avec suspicion, et reconnaît que l'activisme communautaire contribue à rendre cette ville équitable et dynamique. Third, the community suffered the consequences of woefully inadequate responsiveness from government, police, and public institutions and agencies. We heard deep frustration about a lack of reliable information being made available to the community so that people could make informed and safe decisions about whether to go outside or open their business. People were perplexed about a range of decisions that had been taken without their input, such as refraining from enforcing criminal laws and bylaws in the red zone, decisions which dramatically increased the harms they were enduring. And finally, we heard a call for space for dialogue and community building. Everything about the convoy occupation underscores the toxic divisions taking hold in society, the echo chambers that fuel those divisions, and the alarming rapid rise of hate, racism, and white supremacy. While that dimension of the convoy has been acknowledged in media coverage, political debates, and official reviews, to community members that has felt more to be a footnote rather than the foundational underpinning. We have made 25 recommendations organized around 8 core themes. Earn trust, uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, protect human rights, prioritize support to disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, keep the community safe, strengthen emergency response, address hate, build community, and advance inclusion, and ensure accountable follow-up. We've also laid out a timeline for implementation of those recommendations through to June 30th of next year. My fellow commissioners will now highlight a number of those recommendations, beginning with Monia Mazigh.
Good morning, bonjour. Je m'appelle Monia Mazigh et je suis l'une des 4 commissionnaires de la Commission populaire d'Ottawa. Merci Alex pour cette mise en contexte sur notre rapport et sur ce que nous avons trouvé pendant la première partie de notre rapport et sur les thèmes sur lesquels nous nous sommes plus concentrés sur cette seconde partie de notre rapport. My main points are going to be made in French. So I am going to mention all these, the main theme of these recommendations, and then focus on the first recommendation, first set of recommendations. Dans notre rapport, mes collègues commissionnaires et moi avons dénombré 8 grands thèmes de recommandations. Je vais les sommairement mentionner, puis je me concentrerai sur la première recommandation. Gagner la confiance, défendre les droits des peuples autochtones, protéger les droits de la personne, prioriser le soutien aux groupes défavorisés et vulnérables, protéger la communauté, renforcer la réponse d'urgence, lutter contre la haine, bâtir une communauté et promouvoir l'inclusion, assurer un suivi responsable. Donc le premier thème qui est gagner la confiance de qui? Celle bien évidemment des résidents de la ville d'Ottawa, mais certainement ceux qui ont été touchés par le convoi des camionneurs. La ville d'Ottawa a perdu la confiance de plusieurs de ses résidents. Plusieurs se sont sentis abandonnés pendant l'occupation par le convoi. La confiance du public dans l'engagement, la capacité et la compétence de la ville et des autorités locales à respecter les droits et à protéger la santé et le bien-être en temps de crise a été décimée. Nous pensons qu'une ville saine, diversifiée et paisible repose sur le respect et la confiance mutuelle des résidents et des fonctionnaires municipaux. Je vais vous donner un exemple qui nous a été communiqué par certains résidents lors des audiences publiques. Nous avons entendu que lorsque les membres de la communauté d'Ottawa, des résidents, se sont rassemblés le 13 février, par exemple, dans le cadre d'une manifestation pacifique contre une nouvelle vague de véhicules entrant dans la ville pour rejoindre le convoi, ce qui est désormais devenu connu sous le nom de bataille de Pont Billing, ils n'ont pas été soutenus par la police. Ils ont plutôt eu l'impression qu'ils étaient considérés comme des fauteurs de troubles, dont les actions étaient assimilées à celles des participants du convoi. Ce n'est qu'un seul exemple de cette perte de confiance envers les autorités policières, envers les autorités municipales. Pour gagner la confiance des résidents, il faut que les responsables admettent le tort qu'ils ont causé par leurs actions et leur inaction pendant l'occupation, qu'ils expriment des regrets sincères, qu'ils reconnaissent leurs responsabilités envers la population d'Ottawa et envers la protection et la mise en œuvre des droits de la personne, qu'ils adoptent des mesures efficaces pour redresser les torts et empêcher que de tels événements ne se reproduisent à l'avenir. Étant donné cette situation de méfiance et de suspicion envers les pouvoirs, les autorités et la gestion des affaires publiques, nous faisons les recommandations suivantes. Je vais juste me contenter des 3 premières recommandations dans ce sens. La première recommandation, convoquer des assemblées publiques. Nous recommandons que la ville d'Ottawa convoque des assemblées publiques dans les quartiers du centre-ville d'Ottawa les plus touchés par l'occupation par le convoi, afin de permettre aux responsables d'entendre de première main la préoccupation et les expériences des personnes directement affectées dans le but d'informer et de confirmer les mesures correctives et les redressements. Nous demandons que cette recommandation soit mise en place d'ici le 30 juin 2023. La deuxième recommandation, présenter des excuses sérieuses. Nous recommandons que la ville d'Ottawa, la province de l'Ontario et le gouvernement fédéral présentent des excuses sérieuses aux résidents d'Ottawa pour ne pas avoir protégé leurs droits pendant l'occupation par le convoi. Ces excuses doivent, premièrement, démontrer une compétence totale des violations, une compréhension totale des violations des droits de la personne subies par les résidents, les travailleurs et les commerçants. Deuxièmement, reconnaître qu'en tant que gouvernement, il leur incombe de protéger les citoyens contre ces violences de droits de la personne et qu'ils n'ont pas respecté cette obligation. Et troisièmement, s'engager à mettre en œuvre des réformes globales avec une large participation de la communauté et des rapports publics réguliers pour s'attaquer aux causes et aux conséquences de ce manquement aux droits de la personne. Nous demandons que cette recommandation soit mise en place d'ici le 30 septembre 2023. La troisième recommandation, redresser les préjudices. Nous recommandons que la ville d'Ottawa, la province de l'Ontario et le gouvernement fédéral veillent collectivement à ce que les résidents, les travailleurs et les commerçants touchés obtiennent une réparation complète pour les atteintes aux droits de la personne qu'ils ont subies pendant l'occupation par le convoi, y compris des réparations pour les abus et les violations des droits de la personne, des compensations pour les dépenses, les pertes de salaire et de revenus, les pertes commerciales et autres coûts encourus du fait de l'occupation par le convoi, et la prestation de services pour counseling et d'autres services de santé pour aider les traumatismes, les besoins en matière de santé mentale et d'autres problèmes de santé résultant de l'occupation par le convoi. Je vais m'arrêter là. Ce sont 3 premières recommandations que nous faisons. Cette dernière, nous demandons qu'elle soit mise en place d'ici le 30 septembre 2023. Et là, je cède la parole à ma collègue Leilani.
Thanks, Monia, and thanks, Alex, for your comments. I'm Leilani Farha, one of the 4 commissioners before you. I just wanted to start by saying that I've been a human rights advocate and lawyer for more than 20 years now. Maybe it's going on 25 years. And I think sitting as a commissioner on the Ottawa People's Commission might be one of the most important human rights roles I've played. We cannot underestimate how important it is for people to have an opportunity to express their experiences in a human rights situation and offer recommendations for change going into the future. So very pleased that I was able to play a small role in all of this. As Alex said, human rights are at the center of what happened in Ottawa a year plus ago with the Convoy Occupation. The Ottawa People's Commission took human rights as our starting point. We used it to interpret everything that we heard, and we used human rights to inform all of our recommendations. As Alex said, we took very seriously the constitutional right to free expression, assembly, and the right to protest. And we learned that that right, or those rights, were upheld. But we also took very seriously that the right to protest can be limited and can be legally limited if the results of that protest are a curtailment of the rights and freedoms of others. That was most certainly the case in the Convoy Occupation. We discovered, I'm toxic. We discovered, let's try this again. Too far, too close? We discovered more than any other review panel that there were very serious and very upsetting human rights violations experienced by residents in Ottawa. Violations of the right to adequate housing. People were imprisoned in their own homes. People experienced outrageous sounds through the Convoy Occupation, in particular the horns, and were unable to have a peaceful enjoyment of their homes. The right to livelihood. The right to livelihood was interrupted. People couldn't get to work. People lost their jobs. The right to health and health care was impugned. People's health suffered tremendously. And I urge you to read that section of the report describing those experiences, extremely serious circumstances. And people couldn't access basic health care. The right to food was impugned. Security of the person, people experienced assaults and harassment. I think Debbie will talk to that. Mobility rights for persons with disabilities in particular were interrupted, with paratranspo being suspended, the only way for some persons with disabilities to be able to get around. Access to services were disrupted, particularly difficult for people living in homelessness who couldn't access harm reduction and couldn't access drop-in services. And of course, we found many violations of the rights of persons, of Indigenous peoples, including the appropriation of their culture and the invasion of their lands. There was no free, prior, and informed consent offered by Indigenous peoples for the protest. So we've come up with some overarching recommendations, and I'll just touch on 3 significant ones. We suggest that the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and further adopt plans to implement the provisions at a city and provincial level of the UNDRIP. We also recommend that the city adopt a human rights charter. A charter would govern all decision-making, a human rights charter would govern all decision-making made by the city, whether it was about the adoption or suspension of a bylaw, whether it was about a new policy or program. The idea would be that a charter, human rights charter, would be in place, and everything would be sieved through this charter. It would enable residents also to have a say in how their city is governed. It would provide, we recommend the provision of an independent city-level human rights commission that could actually hear from residents in Ottawa about their expectations of their city with respect to human rights. Excuse me. And lastly, and pretty important at this moment, at this press conference, we make a recommendation around better protection for journalists. We heard repeatedly that, in particular, female journalists and racialized journalists had a very difficult time doing the important reporting during the actual occupation. And so we make recommendations that journalists be further supported so that they can do their important accountability work. I'll pass now to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Leilani, and I want to thank my colleagues Alex and Monia as well for their words and for all of you joining us today. My name is Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. I am one of the 4 commissioners and a proud resident of Ottawa for the last 13 years. And to kind of echo what Leilani mentioned with regards to this experience, I would say being a commissioner and being given the privilege to help steward this process and to give my fellow community members the space to have their concerns, thoughts, and experiences heard is probably one of the greatest experiences I've had as an advocate in this city. And so I'm super thankful for this process because it was healing for me too, as someone, and I guess all of my colleagues here, who've endured the Convoy Occupation in some capacity. For the remaining call to actions and the subsequent recommendations I'll be talking about, I think it's really important to emphasize, kind of following up from our first report, of who we actually heard from. We heard from low-income seniors and families, folks who have health challenges, people with disabilities. We heard from racialized residents, to us LGBTQ communities. We also heard from religious minorities, new Canadians, and people who are homeless. And all of these folks who have historically been marginalized in our communities, who have been, I would say, screaming from the top of their lungs, if I'm going to use an analogy, for a very long time pointing to their experiences, have been able to inform the recommendations that we're sharing with you folks today. And that is due in part to our human rights framework that we've applied and that methodology. But I think it's really important to say that these folks had been given the space, even during our testimonies, to share what they would recommend decision makers implement as a result of this process. And so for the remaining call to actions that I'll be speaking to, one, including prioritizing support for disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, keeping the community safe, strengthening emergency response, and addressing hate, build community, and advance inclusion. Under the first call to action on prioritizing support for disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, it's important to reemphasize that many vulnerable individuals and households did not receive proactive outreach from the city to ensure that basic needs and fundamental rights were met. So this includes access to food, healthcare, adequate housing, and livelihood. And for that very reason, we have the following recommendations. We want to see the city develop a citywide needs map and crisis outreach plan to ensure access to essential services when crises like this happen, which I will emphasize we do not want to ever see again. Under this call to action as well, we want to see the further development of crisis outreach plans, but then also ensure access to essential services, whether that's public transit, paratranspo, food programs, etc. Under the call to action to keep communities safe, we know that many community members had to endure violence during the occupation, and that should never happen again. And there's a responsibility that our governments and policing mechanisms have a responsibility to ensuring that community safety. So that's why we're recommending that decision makers develop a policy on protest and community impact. We're also asking for a strengthening of police oversight, which includes reforms to the Ottawa Police Services Board, improving accessibility and responsiveness to communities and public trust. We also want to see an investigation, in particular to the failures to protect residents. And under this recommendation, I will further emphasize that we want to see the City of Ottawa appoint an independent investigator to examine and report on the following things. Number one, allegations that current or former police officers may have provided intelligence, enforcement, and other operational information to convoy organizers. Number two, the decision of the Ottawa Police Service to refrain from criminal enforcement action against convoy participants prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Number three, the failure of Ottawa Police Services to respond to complaints from residents during the occupation. And four, the decision to refrain from bylaw enforcement during the occupation, including because of the risk of security risks faced by bylaw officers and concerns that ticketing might have aggravated the situation. Our final recommendation under this call to action is seeing an increased funding for community safety and well-being. So I will emphasize under this that we want to see the City of Ottawa and the Province of Ontario reduce or reallocate police budgets so as to provide greater resources to social services, community safety programs, anti-racism and gender equality initiatives, mental health services, income support, provision of housing, harm reduction initiatives, transit services, and other programs designed to enhance human rights protections, which I will mention were all missing during the convoy occupation as a result of the lack of leadership seen. Under the next call to action, strengthening emergency response, we know that the emergency response as a result of the convoy was not properly managed by the City of Ottawa. There was a failure to communicate basic information to residents. There was an abandonment of socioeconomic protections, access to essential services, and we saw the failure to coordinate with other levels of government, which had a direct impact on people who live downtown. So for this call to action, what we'd like to see is the establishment of an emergency advisory committee. We'd also like to see a strengthening of Ottawa's emergency management program. And we'd also like to see a coordinated emergency response across all orders of government. And for the final call to action that I'll be speaking on addressing hate, build community, and advance inclusion, it is important to note that many of the marginalized folks that we spoke to during this process all drew the connections between hate, racism, and discrimination that convoy participants had towards residents. And it's important to note that the interconnected ways in which racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other hate and discrimination laid the foundation of this convoy occupation and should absolutely be examined by officials. So the first recommendation under this call to action may be simple in terms of addressing hate, but it's really important to emphasize that that needs to be a coordinated effort across all three levels of government. We want to see all levels of government ensure that there is a prevention and the further spread or manifestation of hate, whether it's in person or online, to develop policies with respect to the display of flags, banners, posters, and other materials that are inherently racist or convey messages of hate, discrimination, and intolerance. We'd like to see equity, inclusion, and accessibility, including strategies like bystander training and identifying or rewarding leadership that fosters and understands cooperation. And we'd also like to encourage curriculum development for schools on human rights civic education, and active citizenship. And I just want to add the very important need for the municipality to take leadership on this, as well as to encourage that coordination across different levels of government. We'd also like to see increased diversity among elected officials and senior municipal officials. We know for some folks, they might say, does that start with decision-making? Is it informed by communities to ensure that these people are put into decision-making positions? I'd say both. I would agree with my colleagues. We want to see both of those things happen, but we want to see that leadership come directly from decision makers, so that in commitment to improve its performance on boosting gender, racial, and other forms of diversity, to increase equity and inclusion and accessibility within elected officials and senior levels of municipal government, as well as senior ranks within Ottawa Police. We'd also like to see support for community initiatives. And in our first report, we talked about how community came together and showed leadership at a time when those we have consented to have in decision-making powers maybe didn't do that. And so we want to see that support financially for these community initiatives, whether it's support for community associations, including many of the community associations who we consulted on in informing these recommendations. And lastly, we want to see the creation of space for dialogue and community building, and making sure that these are funded, and also considering how other commissions similar like this might be needed to help ensure that that culture of healing is something that this city makes normal, and that culture of bringing people together to share their thoughts and recommendation is also normalized and rewarded. Thank you.
We're going to turn it over to questions. I'll just ask folks to limit themselves to 2 questions and go to the back of the line. The microphone is right in the middle of the aisle, just to ensure that everyone has a chance to ask a couple questions. And libre à vous.
Guess I'll go first. First, thank you so much for your time on this and this report. I have tried to read through as much as I can, but 20 minutes before the start of this doesn't allow for much. But just based off what I'm hearing from you, so we've had 2 other reports from the Public Order Emergency Commission, as well as the Auditor General, or the city's Auditor General. So I want to ask, like, how has that informed the recommendations that you have, and what kind of overlaps do you see? Because from my understanding right now, the city is also currently working on some ways to better community services, for example.
So we certainly very much took account of the reports from the Public Order Emergency Commission and from the Auditor General's reviews, and really found that to be a wealth of very important information. It's a different perspective than ours. It certainly provides very helpful information to us, giving a sense as to what was going wrong inside government, inside police forces, including what was going wrong in and amongst the various levels of government. And that's a key piece of understanding why the community impact was so devastating. But what those reviews don't include, certainly don't include really much more than an occasional footnote, is a very thoughtful, informed community perspective. They all heard only from a handful of people bringing that perspective into the commission, into the Auditor General's reviews. And from our point of view, that's really where we need to begin in understanding, number one, why was this such a devastating experience? What was the nature of that? And what went wrong, what truly went wrong on the ground. And so that's how we differ from the other processes.
Can I just add? Sorry, and I don't know where you're from.
Oh, sorry, Cindy Tran with the Canadian Press. I should have said that first, sorry.
You look familiar to me, but just checking. One of the things that we understand from human rights is that if you don't hear from the people who experience potential violations of their rights when you're trying to figure out what to do the next time around, you're not going to create recommendations or solutions that actually work. That if you need to hear from people's experiences, lived experiences, to know how, in a meaningful way, to know how to move forward. And so that's why we took so seriously our role, was because we knew we were the only body that was really hearing from the community, and it's only through that that you can fashion recommendations that'll work on a go forward.
And my second question is that a lot of these recommendations, they do involve the city in many different ways. So I was just wondering, have you had any discussions with the city perhaps, or even OPS about implementing such changes?
We haven't yet. We certainly today have forwarded copies of the report to all three orders of government, to Prime Minister Trudeau, to Premier Ford, and to Mayor Sutcliffe. We've made it very clear that we would welcome an opportunity to meet with them or their officials as early as possible to discuss the recommendations further. We did, as we were preparing our report, reach out to the Ottawa Police Service and made it clear that we would welcome an opportunity for a meeting. We were told that they were receptive to having such a meeting, but despite various back and forths between the Commission and the police, it simply never proved possible to find a time when they were available to meet. So that was regrettable. But certainly also with the police going forward, we're very much open to an opportunity to meet to discuss the recommendations.
Thank you.
Hi all, I'm Liam Fox with the Ottawa Citizen. Thank you for hosting a press conference today to add some more clarification to your certainly thorough report. So my first question was also actually going to be about, are you meeting with any city officials or anything to implement these changes? I'm just wondering kind of what are the most recent next steps that you're going to be taking to consult with the city and with any other form of government?
So I would note that during the process, we did have an opportunity to consult extensively with two former city councillors who were very helpful and engaged, Catherine McKenney and Mathieu Fleury, and would really want to acknowledge their input. I'd also like to note that we do have a city councillor here with us today, Ariel Troster, who I know has followed and engaged with this process very closely, and we value that and appreciate it, and can take from that she will certainly be engaged and active going forward. Beyond that, we have, again, in addition to the high-level letters that went out to the three leaders of the various orders of government, the report has also, probably as of this moment, is in the inboxes of all city councillors and committee members, etc. And it'll certainly be our hope that they're willing to engage, not so much, although we would welcome it, with the four of us, but at community level, with people in the communities who they represent, people who were the ones who came forward and were the basis for these recommendations. That's what will be most essential.
Okay, thank you so much. And my second question is just about, do you think the People's Commission could benefit from consulting with a larger group of people in future and expanding on the report?
We're exhausted. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. My sense is that people's commissions are kind of the wave of the future. In the report, we actually come up with structural ways in which the city could help establish these sorts of, and that was Debbie's very last point, if I recall, these sorts of commissions, more as like a standing thing, that this should always happen. And that was my point about a human rights approach. There's there's actually the idea that the right to participate is a human right itself, and that was missed in the other more formal proceedings that went on about the occupation, the auditor, and the commission. So I don't know if that's getting at I mean, we heard from over 200 people through oral testimony and submissions. Would we have liked to have heard from more? Sure, but I think we did reach capacity for a voluntary kind of thing. I mean, as I said, we say in the report that this should be actually part of the city infrastructure, and then it wouldn't necessarily all be on a voluntary basis, et cetera.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hi guys, I'm Jack Hurley with the Capital Current. I just have a question for you regarding the calls to action. One of the suggestions was further curriculum development for human rights in schools. So A, I'm wondering why that's so important, and B, whether we've made any steps to contact school boards or get things rolling.
That's a really good question. Looking at it from a human rights framework, but then also someone who works within school communities on my day job, we know the importance of early intervention when it comes to addressing things like hate. So, teaching the importance of celebrating diversity and teaching folks how power manifests, and that often is the elephant in the room when we talk about looking at systemic issues at a young age. It's addressing that so that we're creating societies where discrimination doesn't manifest, which is why that was housed under the addressing hate section. And we know that school communities were also impacted during the convoy. That was something that we heard and was reported on in our first report. And we think it's important, considering the linkages between our school boards and the municipality, that come into play, especially for younger folks who, although young people were considered as part of the folks who we spoke to, we obviously didn't have children for a variety of reasons, but making sure that their experiences of what they went through, but then also why their education to create the communities that we want are supported. That's why that recommendation is super key. What was the second part of your question?
It was just kind of with the last two questions, like what steps or have we gotten anything rolling on communicating with school boards, putting programs in place?
I think it's important in this recommendation to emphasize also, I totally agree with the answer of my colleague, that I think also what it is important to emphasize here on the role of the school board, and I think our recommendation in that sense is we notice that there is a polarization, a deeper fracture in several communities in Ottawa, and the role of a school as an institution of education is, first of all, to find a way how to give tools to the kids on all level of their learning process, is to understand these differences, respect them, and not also, live in a sort of their own bubble. I think one of the observation and one of the finding that we realize is that there is a lot of silos happening in our communities, and this occupation brought them really in a bad way. So we hope that the school will be a matter of a tool of inclusivity and also education of critical analysis, misinformation, how can we deal with that? All these, and we look forward for sure if the school would like to have us or to discuss those recommendations and how they can implement them. We would be more than happy to accept those invitations.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing too. I think that's why it's important that this report, as my colleague Alex mentioned, the fact that it's going to different orders of government, in particular the province, considering the jurisdiction of education, and that this particular recommendation would be, if we were invited to a meeting with decision makers at the provincial level, one where I think all of us would want to emphasize that the province take particular attention to, because we are seeing, I think, the ripple effects of exactly what Monia said around that siloing, and also how education has been the now stage for, I guess, the conflicts around the asylum coming into life. And we're seeing it here in Ottawa. We're seeing it in different communities as well. And so I think that kind of drives home really why we want this to be something that all levels of governments look at, but in particular, the province as well.
Okay, thank you.
Oops. Elaine McGregor, Centretown Buzz. I wanted to ask, first of all, you called for an independent investigation into why the police in particular failed to enforce numerous laws. Now, I understand that the Auditor General in her report mentioned that she might be doing a further investigation into the police response to the convoy. Do you think that if the Auditor General did this investigation, that would fulfill what you're asking for here?
I think we'd want to hear more about that, possibly. You'll note that we've actually bundled a number of things together that we believe need further investigation, and the word independent is very important there, the Auditor General being independent. But I don't think we're necessarily looking for a number of siloed investigations. A lot of the things we've highlighted as being of concern are interrelated and interconnected with each other. And so really we want to see one independent officer, body, individual appointed who would be able to look at all of them as a package.
Okay, so that could be the Auditor General, but not necessarily. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the other question I wanted to ask you was about the timeline. Now, you mentioned, I think Ms. Mazigh mentioned June and September for some things, and I think you were also talking about hoping to get all the follow-up done by next June. That was correct? Yeah. So, but I'm just wondering, first, could you clarify that, and could you also tell how are you going to actually, will this group come back together again to see if the recommendations were followed, or how will you actually determine whether the recommendations were followed?
So the timeline we've laid out is quarterly, beginning with June 30th of this year, and then every quarter thereafter through to June 30th of next year. And there's a handful of recommendations in each of those quarters. That doesn't, depending on the nature of the recommendation, that doesn't mean that it will be, or there'd been any expectation that it could be fully done and dusted by that time. In many instances, it may simply be that's the point at which a serious process needs to be underway towards achieving the recommendation that we've laid out. What we would want to see is meaningful steps forward on all of the recommendations according to that timeline. We've not yet determined what our own role might be going forward. I know we're all very much on the hook. You've heard from all of us how meaningful this process has been, how engaged and how honored we feel to have played the role. So I'm sure we'll want to stay engaged to a certain degree, but we're also very cognizant of the fact that really now that we're at the stage of accountability and follow-up, this is in the community's hands, and governments need to acknowledge and recognize that it's in the community's hands. And so recommendations like you heard from Monia Mazigh about town halls, those are the kinds of venues and fora where the follow-up can and should be taking place.
The other, now following up on your question about school curriculum, I mean, that's a provincial thing. In my experience with the province, that it takes forever to get things into the curriculum. I mean, I know I had experience with trying to get bike schooling within the curriculum, and it was taking like 5-7 years. Are you prepared to, do you think it should take that long, or is there any way of speeding it up? Or
maybe I'll defer to Monia or Debbie on that one.
We totally are aware that education is probably something that will take to implement a long time, but also the impact of it will take also more time to see the results. However, I think by recognizing that there are some flaws and some lacks in our curriculum in terms of those what we have been talking about, like the polarization, the lack of critical analysis, the diversity. I think there is some work that is already being done right now, but probably we would expect a complement or something like more, something that would be, and why not? I mean, I would say these are recommendations, right? This is not 100% like the truth or what we think from what we have heard that this is the right step to take. But something even like inviting probably, guest speaker in the schools. It can be as simple, and that wouldn't take years. That can take very quick, to talk about what happened, to let the kids also talk about this. So these are, I think it's all about how responsive the school board, and we would love them to be very quick to respond to some of these suggestions and open, at least until the curriculum will be changed.
Great. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I'll add to it. And I think, Monia, you said exactly what I was going to encourage. And I think this also goes back to what we heard with our first report around, community taking the leadership role and kind of filling in gaps in curriculum, for example, or taking the leadership role on addressing community safety. That there is an importance in officials collaborating with community-led initiatives, and one key piece on that, on the education side, is inviting folks who are already doing this work as guest speakers, as that long-term work on curriculum is happening. And so there are many organizations, headquartered even here in Ottawa, who are doing that work, who go to schools and provide that supplementary education that fosters diversity and inclusion. I think that could be also re-emphasized if the opportunity to speak to the provincial government is given.
Hi, I'm Jean Christie. I'm a resident I live just a few blocks from here, so I lived right on the periphery of the red zone during this occupation. I want to first say thank you for doing what you've done. It's just really reassuring to know that this kind of initiative actually does bubble up when we face what we face. I have read your first report. I haven't yet read in detail the second. So this question is coming from what I heard this morning. You make some recommendations regarding the police that caused me to think you heard some fairly troubling things about potential informants within the police force who were giving information to people who were in the convoy. And I guess my question is, and I realize you're not the police force, and you didn't have privileged access as perhaps some of the other commissions did. But my question is, what did you hear that led you to make the recommendations you make regarding the police force and possible support from within the police force because that, of all of the things you said, that's the one that I find particularly troubling. And as we watched the convoy unfold, I mean, walking down to Lisgar and to Kent Street and Lisgar, where these massive trucks were with the barbecues and the whatever, and on the very first day of the convoy, watching the parking infractions as I went about my business, not really realizing what this was going to become. So my question is, what did you hear that led you to make that recommendation that says we need to dig more deeply into that? So, thank you.
We heard a great deal. Certainly we heard a lot along the lines of what you've just described. People aware of and deeply disconcerted as they watched not simply that the right to protest was being upheld, which people very much appreciated and are supportive of, but that hate and racism and white supremacy was being welcomed into their neighborhoods and given a home, and was being done so with direct and tacit support from a number of police, whether that was the ease with which the large trucks were given access to downtown streets and parking lots and staging areas, or the infamous number of times when police posed for selfies and were seen bringing coffee to convoy participants, etc. I think the more sinister underbelly of that, the possibility that there were some current and/or retired former police who were not just expressing appreciation and support and welcome, but were perhaps going further and providing all sorts of information to convoy organizers, which may well have been decisive for their own purposes in formulating their plans, is again something, obviously no one we heard from had direct knowledge of that, but as the reports of that began to circulate, they became very aware of it, and as you've noted, it was incredibly unsettling for them to imagine that that was a possibility. We also took account of the fact that this very concern came up directly at the Public Order Emergency Commission. There was evidence provided, including by the convoy participants' lawyer, about this happening, and that, in our mind, is perhaps one of the starkest indications that this is something serious. We know that the Ottawa Police Service itself says that they're conducting an internal investigation into this. We don't think that's good enough, given what's at stake for the community. We also know, unless there's something recent that we're not aware of, that the OPP, and there were some of the allegations are about the OPP, have specifically said it's not their intention at this time to carry out an investigation. So this clearly needs much more serious attention. It really should be taken up within all three of the police forces that were implicated, and it needs to be something independent.
I can add, because you asked specifically what did we hear, and I can give you two examples from what we heard during the when we have held the audiences, the public one, the private one as well. Two examples come to my mind. I remember a resident from Ottawa who had who was proud, saying that he comes from a family of military. And he said that the type of logistics he have seen, so he's just a simple resident, but by going on the street and watching what was going on, he said by simply watching that, he realized that there is a lot of what he called military logistics. The fact that everything was organized, the food was brought, the dirty clothes were taken. So of course these can be seen as anecdotal kind of evidence, but I think coming from people, we take them very seriously, and they are corroborated somehow. But what we have heard from some articles, but exactly like Alex mentioned, Commissaire Rouleau spoke extensively, at least in his report, about this infiltration of these extremist groups in the convoy. Another, also what we have heard, I can give you an example. City councillor told us, former city councillor told us that residents told him when they call about, let's say, a truck parked in front of their homes, and they wanted, the Ottawa bylaws to come, the question by the police to the resident is, describe to me the truck. So if it is a big truck belonging to the convoy, they wouldn't come.
And you didn't have a big flag flying.
Exactly, and that was also conveyed to us very explicitly. So that shows, in a way, some sort of complicity of the police, whether conscious or unconscious or deliberate or not, with the convoy. At least in their act, they didn't give any of the tickets. Whereas for the, we heard that for simple residents, some of them were ticketed for different infraction on the street. So I think those two examples maybe can help you see how this double standard, or even more, like the infiltration of some elements, whether military, whether police, whether intelligence, into the convoy was documented.
Hi, it's Ken Rubin. For the first day or two of the convoy, started to go downtown, and I was shocked, and I felt my fellow residents would be too. And I could see the organization. I could see what the police weren't doing. And so I'm really proud, in a way, to see, as the founder of the Ottawa People's Commission, that it's gotten to this stage. But, on the other hand, I think as Alex said, I'd hate to see it as a footnote. I know that you are writing the various levels of government. You may go and talk to schools and so on. But I just think for the record, it would be good to say, well, what do residents want to do, particularly in the inner city? There is the inner city stakeholders group right now that's been meeting a few times. So really the question is, although you guys have limited time and your role may not continue forever, and I want to go on record, what do you think residents should do themselves? Because that's why I started this, because I thought you should hear from residents, and you did, and now it's into a different phase. So just for the record, it would be good to know how you feel this can go ahead. You can't do it alone.
Thanks, Ken, and it's pretty amazing where we are today, right? From your vision. So thank you for your vision and for helping make sure your vision and the vision of a few others got implemented. It's pretty cool. So for me, I mean, we haven't even had an opportunity to, the four of us, discuss that very question, though I know it's top of mind. And certainly as an advocate, it's always top of mind, because you can write a report and send it to governments, but then we all know you got to do a lot of stoking to get traction there. And as you say, we need friends. And so, I mean, what I love the idea of existing community groups like the Inner City Stakeholders Group taking the report and figuring out which pieces they think are most important to them, assuming there are pieces there that resonate, which there should be, and then figuring out what their game plan might be to encourage the city to build a better city, a more human rights friendly city, a more human rights compliant city, and all the necessary infrastructure for that. So, I mean, that's the beauty of these sorts of reports. They are intended for all levels. They're intended to be taken by community and for community to run with them. So that would be my hope. As I said, I haven't discussed that with my colleagues, so they may have other ideas.
Yeah.
Or better ideas.
Yeah, just to echo what you said, you know, when I speak of the reports that we've been able to produce, I often think of them in two ways. I see this as like an archival project of us actually looking at the history of what people experienced, because I often see how quick we are to move on to the next thing and not take that time to collectively remember what we went through. But then on the other side, seeing it as a policy document or an advocacy document that could be used to drive change and to change policy at all levels of government. And so I think it is a matter of ensuring that folks know that these exist, and that requires community, whether it's existing groups that we've mentioned or grassroots organizations who have been engaged in this process, or even individual advocates or engaged city councilors to like remind folks that these reports exist and that they're here to help drive change. And so what I see is that people will do that. They'll use this as a tool to remember, but also use it as a way to motivate change.
And ditto. And maybe just one simple thing I'll add is that, of course, we'll be interested in sitting down with all the folks who have been involved in the People's Commission, community groups and organizations like the Stakeholders Group to think about more kind of organized and formal advocacy strategies. But I think it's also just so essential that to the extent they feel compelled and motivated, individual residents of Ottawa, if they have the opportunity, engage with this report, look at the recommendations, what's there and resonates with their experience, take it forward. Be in touch with your city councillor, your MPP, your MP. There's lots of space here simply for individuals to advocate in whatever ways they feel compelled.
Just follow up. But do you see a different power structure in this city where, for instance, the inner city stakeholders group is legally constituted as a council that the city council, the federal government, and others have to listen to? What is the power tool that you have that isn't just letters to the editor or speeches in schools that's going to dramatically change the way this community operates? Obviously, the city particularly has not come forward. They can meet with people who want to develop sports arenas, but they're not meeting with you. They know you're around. They won elections, but they know you're around. We know we're around. You need some stick or some means to get people power, and they don't have power. In the 70s, for instance, neighborhood planning was a powerful factor in this city. There's gaps. There's nothing in this city that allows people to participate in a meaningful way. And so that is a real problem, which is hard to overcome.
I'll just, oh, sorry, Monia, were you going to?
Sure.
You go ahead.
Well, I think one of we heard the same thing from different stakeholders. And one of the theme that actually came very much was repeated was the earning the trust. The broken trust. There is no trust. And what you have explained is totally that there is some sort of groups working, but there is a lot of suspicion vis-a-vis the police, vis-a-vis those institutions. So I think what you are asking is something I think that is going to be built step by step, I hope. I don't think our recommendations are going to change overnight the way that have been done through many, many previous years. But the fact that this commission was put in place, I think the fact that we work together from different backgrounds and, presented those recommendations, I think I see it as a positive probably step, and who knows what is going to be born out of this. And I hope it will be maybe either a continuation of other commission. I think the mobilization of a way to mobilize people, bring them together and let them ask for the change. I think we cannot just ask for meeting. We have to keep asking for change. And it is difficult. I totally admit it is very, very difficult. It is tough. Now that this has been done, what will happen? I don't know, but I can only hope that this will be a good tool for different communities, for different organizations, for individual to say, listen to us. We have been validated in what we have been saying, and I think let's change things. And this is why we call it after the occupation change. So I hope that this will bring change. How? It's going to be something that we will figure out by working together, I guess.
I'll just add, I spoke to the idea of a human rights charter for Ottawa, and sometimes people think that idea is like airy-fairy, but in fact, there is a global movement to create human rights charters in cities around the world. There are human rights cities around the world. And what they do is they build human rights infrastructure at city level. And that infrastructure should do exactly what you're suggesting, Ken, which is set up formal procedures and mechanisms for community to be able to bring forward ideas and be able to participate in all decision-making at city level. I actually saw this at work in Seoul, South Korea, and it can be quite powerful, where they had a very entrenched mechanism for groups and individuals to weigh into city planning, for example, around, and in that case it was around evictions and things like that. But I take quite seriously what you're saying, Ken. I mean, of course, a report is a piece of paper. It's all just a piece of paper. And we have to breathe life into the recommendations. And that will be up to community groups as well as, I mean, all of us are active both at city level and provincial level and national level amongst all of us. So I'm sure we are all wedded to breathing life into this thing as well. It also can be used in a pop-up kind of way. You know, an issue comes up that may not seem to be about the OPC and you'll, the findings of the OPC, and you'll find suddenly people are referring to it in other submissions about other relevant and related issues. So that's how we get life into the paper, I think.
Well, thank you so much to all four of our commissioners, and also a special thank you to Michelle Hurtubise and the Centretown Community Health Centre. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning, whether you're here in person or online. The report is available as of now on our website, opc-cpo.ca, and our lovely folks at the desk in the hallway are available to assist anyone who is interested in coordinating an interview with one of our commissioners. On that note, I wish you a pleasant day, enjoy the weather, and hope to see you soon.